Hey, what is going on, everybody? It's Anthony, the host of the RPG Speak podcast. As you know, as you've been listening to it this whole time, thank you very much for that. Today we are going to be talking about a topic that is pretty deep and could lead to some, controversy or whatnot between the listeners, but that's perfectly fine. We can have discussions about it and whatnot. That's what I'm all about. But today, I am going to be talking to you about how to be the best DM you possibly can and how I became a Dungeon Master as well. As far as Dungeons and Dragons and Deadlands and stuff like that's concerned. Don't take it to a weird place. That's not what this podcast is about. At least not yet. But yes, I did a video on this on my YouTube channel, The Canadian Gaming. And I want to touch on this topic as well because the first official episode of RPG Speak was my interview with my DM for the longest time, Renavion. And in that video, we talked about, his journey to being a dungeon master, how he got into, gaming, stuff like that. And he, in that, revealed as a dungeon master, it's really up to you. The whole game is up to you. He talked about as being a DM that the rules in the book, they're there to be guidelines, essentially. They're there to build your story around. And now, obviously, Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot, a lot of tabletop RPGs have their own, they've got their own, modules, pre-written campaigns and whatnot. But those they can be fun, don't get me wrong. I've played a lot of good modules, but those are for, dungeon masters who either don't have the time or don't feel like making their own homebrew, as we call it, story. And I'm not, I don't want to throw shade at dungeon masters who use modules because, they are a great tool. And they can be used to create a really good campaign. Like I said, I've played a lot of good modules in my time, my 13, 14 years of role-playing. But with being a DM, there's so much more than just reading. Even with the modules, there's so much more as to being a DM than, just reading a book and a story. You've got to make your players feel like they are actually in the world. You might make your players feel like they are their character. So, essentially, you are still creating the world, whether it's a pre-written campaign or your own. And that's what the rules are there for. Like I said, they're guidelines for you to build your story around. You can incorporate rules as you seem fit. You can, you can incorporate the rules you want, basically. You can pick and choose based off of what you want your game to be. If you want your game to be, a cookie cutter, straight down the middle, basic game, you can do that. Or if you want your game to be completely off the cuffs, your players are going and just burning down villages, or your players are just going and, your wizard is enlarging random things at will just to cause chaos. You can do that too. It's amazing the freedom that games like Dungeons and Dragons give you with the rules. You can, like I said, you can do essentially whatever you want to do. And a big part of that's a big part of being a DM, and a big part, it coincides with improv, but that's another really big part about being a DM, and that is improv. You've got to be really good at improving, because I don't care how, rules, lawyery, cookie cutter, straightforward your dungeon, your adventuring party is. Your group's going to make some decision at some point that's going to make you scratch your head and be like, what the fuck just happened? It's inevitable. It's going to happen. My group seems to do it to me on purpose, just because, that they like screwing with me. But because of that, I have developed incredible improv skills. It's a bit of a humble brag, I've learned through being a DM that I'm great at improv, and improv is an essential part of being a DM, because you need to make those quick-witted decisions on the fly. Your players, they want to, say they're in a dungeon and somebody wants to enlarge a torch on the wall. They want to enlarge a torch, set the building on fire, and whatnot. You got to be like, okay. Yes, I'll let you do it, but say something like, okay, so you enlarge the torch. Now you are entrapped inside of a burning building. And now there's a new problem that you've developed because of their actions. And that's a good way to keep, it's a good way to keep your players on their toes with the decisions that they make. They enlarged this torch, made a big fire, caught the building they were in on fire, and boom, now they've got another problem. They're in a burning building that's collapsing on them, and they got to find a way out, or else they're all dead. So you've got to find your way out of these situations with your improv skills. And, some people, they're not really good at improv. It's going to take some time for them to think of a situation. And while that's fine, it does end up, killing the flow of the game at times. Obviously, some of the best improvers, even myself included. Like I said, I consider myself incredibly good at improv when it comes to D&D. And even I find, some of the things I'm doing, I've got to think of ways to put my players, the situation that they're in. There was a time where, this was the first Deadlands campaign that I ran. Deadlands, if you guys don't know, is a post-apocalyptic tabletop RPG set in a post-apocalyptic world. There were super nukes essentially dropped on every part of the world, putting it into this state of, horrors coming to life, hell rising, stuff like that essentially. But there was a time where, it was the first session, and one of my players, their character was a bounty hunter, and they went into the starting town looking for their bounty because that was their last known location. Well, the bounty did happen to be in the town, and the player, it was in the middle of a busy town. They were smack dab in the middle of the city. The player went up, killed his bounty, and I had planned at that point, I was not planning for my player, first of all, to just go up and execute somebody in the middle of a busy city. That wasn't something I had planned. I planned on them, staking stuff out, following them into a place, and that was going to lead into a bigger story involving like a gang and a mob boss and stuff like that. I had this whole thing planned out based on this one sole character. And I don't know, this was very early in my DMing career, so I was a bit of a noob when planning out stories, because I don't plan out my stories very well. Really at all. I improv my way through pretty much all of it. I've got a baseline, and I improv it, but I'll get to that in a bit. My point is, I didn't plan for them to take out an integral part of the story right then and there. So I had to, think for a little bit and be like, okay, how am I going to get myself out of the situation that my players caused? Okay, well, he executed in the middle of a big city. People definitely saw it. Okay, so now the authorities are after you. The authorities are after you, and you are being surrounded very quickly. You've got two options. Try to run and escape, or surrender. They ended up, escaping. And, I had to improv my way through the rest of the session pretty much. And that, it led to them going to a certain part of town that the gang that I was going to introduce them to, they owned it, and they ended up running into the gang members, and they completely obliterated the gang members. But because I was able to improv, my way out of that situation and put the gang back into the story, they now have a big enemy in the game. And on top of the main enemy that I had, so now they've got two enemies, and now they've got, now their situation is a bit more dire, I guess you can say. Their situation is a bit more rough because now they're being pursued by two very powerful enemies. And, there's plenty of other examples that I can give you, but it's just that example is a demonstration on how improv is key to being a dungeon master and getting yourself out of situations. And it's even not just getting yourself out of situations. You've got to voice NPCs. You've got to create scenes in your mind and then put them into words. All of this is part of improv, which I'm going to keep reiterating this because it is important, which you need to be a DM. And you could be the best DM ever. You could be the best DM. You've planned out your campaign from beginning to end. You've got every adventure written down and whatnot. But even those guys still need to improv. Or you could be a DM like me and have maybe 2 to 3 sentences, if I'm lucky, about, the main plot point of that current session, and then just improv your way through the entire thing. My whole thing is I created a world. I did that. I did create an entire world. Hell, I created an entire continent with cities and towns and even trading posts and mountains. And I have, I've got details of all of them listed. So in my brain, I materialize them in my brain. Yeah, that makes sense. I put them in my brain and think about how they look. And then I say what I see in my head to my players, and then they make the decisions based off of that. NPC dialogue is completely improv for me. Main characters are almost completely improv for me. I've got the big bad guy. I've got, some mid-tier character bosses and whatnot. I've got some important NPCs, but that's it, and half the time I don't even have names for these people. Half the time I come up with names on the fly, or, I use a random generator because I'm lazy. But every session that I've had, my players have loved it, because it just turns into a giant ball of chaos. But controlled chaos, I guess, if you will. Don't sue me, Jeff Dunham. But it's this controlled chaos that the players are able to work with, and if the players are able to work with it, you're able to work with it. And the goal, my biggest rule is if the players understand it, you should be able to understand it, and vice versa. If you can understand it, your players should be able to understand it. And if they don't, then you explain it to them, and if they still don't, well, then that's their fault, and you keep going. Because you can't sit there and explain to somebody what something is. That kills the flow of the game. The whole point of D&D, one of the greatest aspects of D&D is the flow of the game. Whether it be in combat, you just role playing with NPCs, you're role playing with each other's, the players, you're role playing with each other's characters. Though you as the DM are there to keep the flow of the game going. And if you've got to stop and, explain stuff to your players, that kind of kills the flow of the game. If you're talking as an NPC in the game explaining stuff to players, that's completely different, because the NPC is in the game, and in the game, the players can work off of it. Now, if you're talking above board and trying to explain it to somebody, the flow of the game kind of gets lost. And, it's always okay to ask a question if you didn't understand something. It's always okay if the player asks a question if they don't understand it. And I encourage players to ask questions if they don't understand it, because if they don't understand something, then they could do something that also kills the flow of the game. Or, if they don't understand it but the rest of the group does, then they could do something that, fucks with the rest of the group's plans, or vice versa. If the player doesn't understand what's happening and the rest of the group is doing something that the player doesn't understand, that player is completely lost, and it kind of takes them out of the game as well. So if your player asks a question, answer it as best as you can. But ultimately, it's going to be up to them to figure out what's going on as well. And that's a lot of things. That's one thing I don't believe a lot of people understand, is dungeon masters, they're there to, feed you the story. They're there to make sure you are enjoying the game and make sure you understand the story. And at the end of the day, a dungeon master can only do so much to explain the story. And if it's just one player that's not understanding, but the rest of the group is, then it's on that one player to try to understand it. Because if you're spending all of your time, if you're spending 5, 10, 15 minutes trying to explain something to one player, then the rest of the group is left out. The rest of the group is just sitting there like, what are we doing? Can we get back to the game, please? And that's unfair to everybody else. And one of the rules I have is the majority outrules the minority, legitimate democracy. And so if I know the rest of my group completely understands what's happening and it's just one person, one, two people that don't understand at all, then I'm just going to keep going with the game. That might sound harsh, but like I said, I'm there to keep control and flow of the game. I'm not going to spend 10 minutes explaining it to one or two people who aren't, understanding it when the rest of the group is. Because if most of the group is understanding it, then that means you conveyed it as best as you can already. And just that one, and it's just that one player for whatever reason, whether they weren't paying attention before, or whether they, whether they're just, off in space, or whatever, or they just simply don't understand it. That's like I said, it kills the flow of the game entirely. So, like I said, one of the big rules, majority overrules the minority. And it seems, like I said, it seems harsh, but at the end of the day, it's your decision. And this could be misconstrued as, the Dungeon Master's God, which isn't true whatsoever. The whole the DM is always right thing. It's always misconstrued as, the DM is on like a power trip or whatever, whatever the DM says goes, the DM is God, stuff like that. And it sucks, because then there's this whole misconception about whether the Dungeon Master's ruling is like whether the Dungeon Master is playing favorites, or whether the Dungeon Master is being fair, whether the ruling's correct, and it can create some tension between the DM and players. But the rule the DM is always correct is, it's not a written down rule or anything, but it's a universally understood rule within the gaming community that the DM is always right. When the DM makes a call, they make a decision, that decision stands. You do not argue with your Dungeon Master, because again, that kills the flow. If you're a rules lawyer, which if you don't know, I don't know how you wouldn't know, but if you don't know, a rules lawyer is somebody who really likes to play by the rules, obviously. That it's very self-explanatory. The rules lawyer will speak up and say, no, you can't do this, it's not in the rules. Or, they'll specifically look up a rule just to try and argue with the DM. And that's not what that's not what you should do. Because, like I said, at the end of the day, the DM's decision stands. And the DM's decision will always stand. I don't care who you are. You could have been playing D&D since its release. Or you could be, it could be your first session. I don't care who you are. If the Dungeon Master makes a ruling or a decision, you follow that decision, you follow that ruling. Whether you like it or not, you do not sit there and argue with the Dungeon Master for 5-10 minutes, because then the rest of the group is, again, sitting there looking like, this is not what I'm here for. I'm here to have fun, not watch two dudes bicker, or women, we're all inclusive here, if you whatever. You're there to have fun, and if you're constantly challenging each other, nobody else is having fun. Even you're not having fun. That's the whole point of it. The rules lawyer isn't having fun because the DM is not playing by the rules, but the DM's not having fun because the rules lawyer keeps challenging them about not playing by the rules. And then in turn, the rest of the group isn't having fun because they're watching the DM and the rules lawyer go at it, because the DM's not playing by the rules and the fucking rules lawyer wants him to play by the rules, and it's a whole mess. I've seen it happen in several groups that I've been a part of. So that's why the DM is always right is such an important rule, and is why it can also be, misconstrued about the DM on a power trip, or the DM, abusing power, stuff like that. But it's not. It's specifically for flow of the game. And, this is coming from, all of this stuff, by the way, is coming from, someone who's been DMing for, I think I've been DMing games for 6-7 years now. So I am by no means a master DM. I've got great improv skills and the ability to make my players have a good time playing in my campaigns. those are the two qualifications I have. My dungeon master Renavion, he's been playing D&D he's been playing D&D for decades. He was born the same year D&D came out. He's been playing it since he was in middle school. And he's able to go into this topic a lot more than I am in the last episode with the interview. But so I'm not saying this is how it should be done. I'm just saying this is how it's well, I guess in a way I am saying this is how it should be done, but I'm not saying that you have to do this. I'm saying that it's better if you do this. Obviously you can you can be a DM as a rules layer. You can follow the rules cookie cutter and whatnot if you've got a group that likes that. And that's another big thing for, being a DM is catering to your group as well. Sure, it's your world, your campaign, your game, you created the whole thing, but you've got to build the story around your group. If one session they're, having a great time and, completing missions and role playing with every character they meet, stuff like that, and they're loving it, but then the next session you do something and they're just like, we're not feeling it, that's something you've got to improve upon. You've got to create your games and your stories based around what your players like doing. And each player is different. There are some players who just really enjoy combat. There are some players who really enjoy RPing, and then there are some players who like doing both. And it's important to mold your story and your campaign around what all these players like. If you've got a group of 4, one person really likes combat, but not so much the whole RP thing. One player really likes the RP, but not so much the combat. One player really likes both, and one player, which just kind of goes with the flow. You've got to mold your campaign around that. You've got to have equal parts combat, equal parts campaign. And you've got to find that perfect balance, because what you think might be a good enough amount of combat might not be for that player. And same with the RP. If you put a lot of RP in there that you think is good enough, it might not be good enough for that player, or vice versa. It might be too much. So it's a big conundrum that you've got to figure out how to work out with your group. I'm lucky enough that all of the groups I've run, I've managed to read them pretty well, and at least my main group, they really like both role playing and combat. So that makes it very, very easy for me to plan out my sessions. But I've also been in groups where, they just, like, the whole group just really likes the whole combat thing, with a little bit of story in there. So I had to put in as much combat as I possibly could, but also make a decent story, behind it. One of my groups, they really, like, the whole group was just really combat oriented. We had a fighter, we had a war domain cleric, we had a barbarian, and we had a wizard. And they were all, like, the wizard just kept getting like, whenever they leveled up or whatnot, they would just use spells that caused destruction for fighting. The fighter, barbarian, war domain cleric kind of speak for themselves, but they all created characters based off combat. So what I did was I created a story where they were all soldiers in they were soldiers. I gave them a choice where they could be soldiers in the Royal Army or soldiers in the Resistance, and they all chose Resistance. It was a vote, pretty much, and they voted in majority to be part of the Resistance. So they were soldiers in a Resistance, and I crafted a story where they were soldiers in a Resistance that was trying to take down a tyrannical royal family. And this campaign was combat based. They were sent out on special ops missions to take out a base, or and then some missions they were on the front lines of a giant battle. They were there when they took the main castle and dethroned the king. So that was very combat orientated. And then I had some other groups, like I had this one group where all of them were, well, I won't say all of them, but most of them really enjoyed the role-playing stuff, but they also wanted, good enough combat in there. So they wanted, so I had to craft it around that. And that's probably the easiest type of game to craft around, is a group that is equal parts combat, equal parts role-playing. And so for this one, I did the generic, you start off in a town, you're all in a tavern, and let them role play it out. I described the scene, and one of my players eventually, caught the eye of each other, and they started talking, and they got a mission to, I can't remember what it was, this was like 3 years ago, but they got a mission to do something, and they all decided, you know what, we're all here together, let's do it and get paid. So they went off, and this group's story was, one of their characters' backstories was they were exiled from their homeland. They were exiled for treason, but this character only committed treason because the king, he didn't really commit treason. He had evidence that the king was, for lack of a better term, embezzling money from the taxes levied onto the citizens of the country and using it to, for his own personal gain. So, instead of the promises that the king made, better city infrastructure, stuff like better police, stuff like that, he was using it for his own gain. And he had proof that would have gotten the king dethroned, but the king found out and ended up, accusing him of treason and exiling him. So the main story, sorry, I hit my mic there. So the main story was them going through and clearing his name. They had to re-find evidence that king was, that king was doing what he was accused of. And so that story went on for quite a few sessions. I don't think it got them to level 20. I think it got them to level like 16. And so, they finished it, and that was it. They role played asking people for information. They fought, guards and assassins that the kingdom sent after them. So it was easy to balance that. Now, groups that are fully role playing, those are a bit more difficult to plan for, because everybody has their own different style of role playing. There's players that will get really into it and have full-on conversations with NPCs and befriend NPCs and stuff like that. Then you got players who, they really like the RP, but they don't exactly know how to talk to NPCs. So, they'll give like one-line answers, or, the NPC will do most of the talking, and they'll just be like, okay, stuff like that. You've got to find a balance of role-playing for all, like, mainly role-playing groups that makes everybody feel comfortable role-playing. And it's weird for people to, like, role-play. There's a stigma behind it, but it's difficult to plan for all role-playing sessions, is my point. Even for some of the best, DMs out there, it's difficult to plan for role-playing because you don't know who your characters are going to talk to. You can plan out, a city guard chief, or the king, or a royal family member, stuff like that. But there's a chance that your players won't talk to them. So you've also got to kind of plan out or use your improv skills, for that random patron in the bar, that one of your players, that your party goes up to and asks about, do you know this person or something like that? Or, same thing with a barkeep, or just a random person off the street, or a shopkeeper, stuff like that. You got to plan for that stuff. And, I mean, I guess you don't have to plan for it, because I don't. I'd be a hypocrite saying if you had to plan for it, because, like I said, I don't plan for anything. I mean, I plan for my characters to, inevitably fuck something up, but I don't plan stuff like that. And it's interesting to see how different players react to different NPCs and stuff like that based off of their characters. Because a player shouldn't be playing the game based off of themselves. They should be playing the game based off of their character. And the whole it's what my character would do thing has got a really bad stigma of, like people abusing it to do what they want. Somebody's a rogue and they just kill a random person on the street because, they've got the assassin subclass or whatever. And, so they just kill this person right off the street, randomly, no explanation, and then they're like, what? I'm an assassin. It's what my character would do. But in the end, no, it's not what your character would do. An assassin is somebody who takes on, assassination contracts and kills the person who the contract's for, and anybody who, poses a threat to them and fulfilling their contract. You don't just go up to a random person on the street and, kill them. That's what we call a murder hobo. And murder hobos are incredibly, I won't say they're incredibly tough to run, but they are a bit difficult to run in a sense that you've got to create characters in your game to, pretty much to advance any story. And murder hobos have a tendency to just murder everybody they meet. Just kill them right off the bat. They give them information, then you kill them. No witnesses, stuff like that. Which in itself isn't difficult to plan for. What's difficult to plan for is the consequences your players face and the consequences the death of that character has on your world. Because you don't know who they're going to kill. What the fuck? My phone just went off. I apologize for that. But yes, it's difficult to plan for murder hobo parties because you could, have an info broker and they talk to an info broker, they give them the information and then you stab them. Okay, well now the person that info broker works for has found about the info broker's death, and now that person doesn't exist in the world. So that person no longer gives information, and that means you've got other, in-game, you have other groups that, needed information from him, and now they can't, so they go after the party for killing their info broker or the info broker's boss, stuff like that. There's plenty of things that could happen from them killing somebody, but you can't plan for who they kill unless you plan for everybody to die, which is a lot of work, and I don't feel like doing that much work, which is why I'm happy none of my groups are murder hobos. So murder hobos, they're not necessarily a bad party, they're just difficult to work with pretty much. But then that again goes back to the whole improv thing, because you can't plan for every NPC death, because if you did, well, that you just can't actually do that because you don't know what NPCs are going to be in the game unless they're, main NPCs, then in which case you can plan for them to, whether they die or live, you can plan for that. But random NPCs off the street, your character, like one of your players goes up, like I said, kills a random person, that person could have just been a normal common citizen, where, in which case, they wouldn't have that big of an impact on the world. But then that person they killed also could have been, the owner of one of the biggest taverns and inns in the city or town. And now that they're dead, that tavern and inn goes out of business, and boom, now you've got this big staple of a city gone, So now you've kind of got a plan on what happens there. Then you've got to insert like an entire city guard essentially, and at least what I do is I put the town guard on their trail. There's an investigation, but the players don't know it yet, and things will work itself out eventually, I think. Either that or your players will end up executed. But the fact of the matter is, you can't plan for everything. So, improv is essential. Half this episode's been me talking about improv. That's how important it is. But another one of the big things that's important to being a good DM is establishing a relationship with your players. A lot of D&D groups are, most D&D groups actually are people who know each other in real life. At least all of my D&D groups, they are people I know in real life. They are friends and or family. So I have a really good connection and friendship and relationship with them. So it's easy for them to talk to me and me to talk to them. Now, if you're one of those people who, goes on Roll20 or D&D Beyond or whatever, or, on Reddit forums and stuff like that, and, is like searching for a D&D group of 4, 6, however many people, and now you're playing with a bunch of random people, it's very important for you to get to know those people. It's very important for you to be able to kind of just like get into the group. You want to befriend every member of the group, and you want to make sure that group is, coexisting with one another. Because if, you've got a player that, you've got a person you've never met, they're there for the campaign, you've never met them, and you're trying to run them on the game, it's difficult for somebody you've never met to get behind you as a DM, because they don't know your style of DMing, and you don't know their style of, playing as a character. So you've got to talk with them and find out what they like and what they don't like, and incorporate it into the story. And building a relationship with your players helps doing that. Because if you have that, friendship with your players, they are far more comfortable coming and talking to you about, hey, I didn't really like it when this happened in the game, it wasn't very fun for me, or, they say this was really good, I loved this, do more of this. It makes them more comfortable for them to talk to you one-on-one, or even in the group, and it's makes it easier for them to role play with you as well as NPCs. And making sure your players form some sort of friendship relationship with each other makes it easier for them to play off each other in the game, whether it's talking directly to each other or whether it's talking, to an NPC as a group. It's easy for them to get a grip on each other's role-playing styles. And then even in combat, it's easier for them to plan. If your players don't know anything about each other, they can't really plan. They plan based off of the characters that they make, but not off of the actual player themselves, because there could be a player who, they're playing a human fighter, most basic of the classes. They're playing a human fighter, and their whole play style is just attack straight on, no thought whatsoever, deal as much damage as possible. But then you've got somebody who's, say, playing a ranger. That's funny, playing a ranger. But no, say they're playing a ranger, and their play style for combat is, devising a plan to flank the enemy, and get advantage because they're flanked, because the enemy's flanked, and have them go up in a tree to provide air cover, I guess, with their bow and arrow or crossbow or whatever, and then the rest of the group, encircles the enemy and flanks them so they can get all these dice advantages and stuff like that. Then they want, like the wizard or the sorcerer to cast a spell. They want the bard to, start supporting, stuff like that. Those two play styles can clash very much if they don't know each other. If the players playing as those play styles don't know each other very well and don't know that that's their play styles, it can clash with everything depending on who gets the higher initiative. So, I mean, if the ranger gets the higher initiative, they can plan, but the player who likes to charge in head on, they may or may not be okay with that because, their whole combat style is charging head on, and vice versa. You've got, the person who likes to charge in head on, gets the higher initiative and is the first one to attack the enemy. Then, there goes the ranger's whole plan, and then now they're feeling some sort of animosity between them because, they didn't plan anything, because that's not their style. So it's very important to form relationships with your players and make sure your players form relationships with each other. That's why Session 0 was such an important thing. Session 0 is more important than people think. A lot of people like to just jump into, the first session, players meet, group up, and start the mission. They start the main campaign without knowing what each other and each other's characters are. Like how the player is going to play this character, and the character strengths and weaknesses and personalities and whatnot. So that's what Session 0 is supposed to be. The characters meet, they talk, they get sent on a, small beginner's quest. Some goblins are raiding farms, so you got to go and take out this small pack of like 7 goblins. Or, there's bandits that have been attacking and raiding caravans for the last month. You get sent on a caravan for protection, the bandits attack, they fight back, stuff like that. There's very simple missions, very simple cookie cutter missions that you can plan a session 0 for. And that helps, the players figure out what everybody's characters are capable of, what they can do. They can plan their own, they can plan how they're going to play their characters based off everybody else. They learn their party members' personalities and stuff like that. So it's something that really should be done. It doesn't need to be done, but it really should be done. And that's about the gist of it. It's the main takeaways here are improv is important. The DM is always right does not mean that the DM is God. It just means that the DM is in control of the game and, the game flow and stuff like that. It just means don't argue with the DM pretty much. And relationships are important. Also probably the biggest take from this is that the rules are not the game. The rules are a guideline for the game, but the rules are not the game. The game is what you and your players make it. It is not, the rules are not there to say this is what you are supposed to do. The rules are there to say this is what you can do, or this is what this should do, but not what it is going to do. That's probably the biggest takeaway here, It's your world, it's your game, you do what you want with it. And if somebody in your group has a problem with that, they can come and talk to you about it. If they still have a problem with it, see ya, gone, bye. Because you don't want somebody like that in your group. You don't want somebody in your group that's going to challenge you for every decision that you make. You don't want somebody in your group that is going to argue with every party member because of the decisions they make. You want people in your group that are going to be, they're going to work together, they're going to be a cohesive unit, and they are going to work as a team. They are going to, and that in turn is going to make them all have a lot more fun. It's the players have fun based off of the DM. And if the DM is noticeably having fun, the players are more than likely going to be having fun, and vice versa. If, the DM is noticing that the players are having a blast, the DM is going to end up having a blast. And that's like the best feedback somebody can get as a DM is that the players are visibly enjoying your game. So that's pretty much all I've got for you guys today, because we are unfortunately out of time for this episode. But I do want to thank you guys all for watching RPG Speak. This is becoming one of the best things I've done in a while. I'm really enjoying doing it. There still is no set schedule. I think for the next few ones, it's going to be once a week, and I know that for a fact. If I'm going to have any schedule, it's going to be 1 episode a week, like most podcasts. But I don't know how long that's going to last because, my life is, kind of insane at the moment. But rest assured, things will, smooth out at some point, and this podcast will eventually, have some sort of schedule and track, and, it'll be a little bit less sloppy as as this episode has, because like my game sessions and as a DM, I'm not really planning these. I come up with a topic, put some bulletin points in, and then I just talk about them, and I don't talk about them in line of the bulletin points I've made, because I have ADD and ADHD, and things just kind of happen in my brain, but my mouth moves faster than my brain can think. So, but yes, that is going to be all for this episode of RPG Speak. Like I said, I do really want to thank you guys for listening. This is a blast, and stay tuned for next episode, where we will be talking about some more role-playing stuff. Have fun, everybody.